a lot of interest in this. But regardless, I'm glad that everybody turned out. It's a good showing. It's a good sign for our local historical society, isn't it? The topic tonight. The topic tonight is a local gangster, Charlie Harris, and his interaction with the FBI. This is not a talk about what's going on in Pond Creek. The topic tonight is not so much about what he didn't do in his life, but rather the topic is, how does an outside agency, an outside bureaucracy view us as Wayne Countyans, and the relationship between the FBI and Mr. Harris? It's all the rage nowadays when there's a speaker, the first thing they do, excuse me, is to offer what's called full disclosure. Well, now's my chance, excuse me, for full disclosure. Full disclosure here. According to family legend, my grandfather and my great-grandfather ran errands for the Shelton gang. I have no shame in this. The fact of the matter is, if you lived in southeastern Wayne County in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, you probably had some dealings with the Shelton gang. That did not make you necessarily a criminal, perhaps an accomplice to criminal activity at some level, but I'm not saying my grandpa and my great-grandpa were thugs or killers, but they knew the Sheltons. And I tend to believe these stories that they ran errands for the Sheltons. A lot of people did. Having said that, if you're here tonight to hear some sentimental tale about gangsters of old robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, you're in the wrong place. I have very strong opinions about this. The Shelton gang, they were killers and thugs and criminals. Charlie Harris was a criminal and a killer, and a convicted killer. So I'm not here to romanticize what happened in the past. It's a dark stain on our community. This is a story about gangsters, thugs, killers, and criminals who do what gangsters, thugs, and criminals do. Regrettably, more often than not, in the 1940s and 1950s, these things were done with impunity in our county. And all too often, local law enforcement was either unable or unwilling to do much about it. And it was with the help of the FBI that a eventually convicted double killer, Charlie Harris, was brought to justice. Now, I've heard the stories about the Shelton gang and Charlie Harris growing up in my family, but I wanted to get an outsider's perspective of this. So after the onset of the pandemic in March of 2020, in April of 2020, I caused to be served on the Federal Bureau of Investigation a Freedom of Information Act request, requiring them to provide to me all legally available records of the Bureau's dealings with Charlie Harris. In typical bureaucratic fashion, by August, I'd received a response. And quite a response it was, some 439 pages. It's about this thick if you print it out one-sided. Now, regrettably, the problem here is that these documents raise way more questions than they answer questions. There are no smoking guns in these documents. These documents fit into two broad categories. Please allow me to explain both. The first batch of documents I received, is some 52 pages. These documents are entirely a workup, a biographical sketch by the department in the year 1958 as to Charlie Harris. The second batch of documents is more voluminous. The second batch of documents concern the Bureau's efforts to find Mr. Harris during a nationwide manhunt of Charlie Harris in 1964 and in 1965. Now, back to the first batch of documents. Let's take them in chronological order. In 1958, the Bureau decided, at the highest levels of the Bureau, the Bureau decided that they were going to target Mr. Harris. Now let's be clear about something. They were not going to target Mr. Harris for investigation because he's running some bootleg joint in Pond Creek. That's not what this is about. They worked up a full-blown biographical sketch of Charlie Harris from birth until that time. Thank you. Somebody's a mind reader. Why? Now, when I look at this biographical sketch of Mr. Harris, the first question I asked is, why 1958? Why was the Bureau not looking at Mr. Harris in the late 40s and early 50s, when the gang war between Mr. Harris and the Shelton gang was at full tilt? And that gang war, the battlefield for that gang war, was right here in Wayne County. And some of you lived through that. I'm not asking you to tell me what your age is, but as I look across this audience, some of you lived through that. The late 1940s, when a bomb is planted in downtown Fairfield, and I'm told that windows in the businesses around the courthouse square were damaged. I'm told that windows in our courthouse were blown out as a result of this bomb. I was born in 1967, so I didn't live through this. I find this incredible. And the example I used, and I've said this a number of times in public, my gosh, if some gangster set off a bomb next to the courthouse today, we would cancel school for a month and a half. I don't know what happened back then with the folks back in Wayne County back then. I guess it was just another day in the life. I don't know. Gang war here in Wayne County in the late 40s, when folks are gunned down on the streets of Fairfield, when buildings are torched throughout the county. I couldn't understand why 1958, but as I went through these documents, I started to figure out the answer as to why the Bureau was targeting Mr. Harris in 1958. And the goal here is not so much to rein in Charlie Harris. The goal is to try to develop information to get Mr. Harris in a compromising position so that he would offer either information or testimony against a bigger fish in a bigger pond. It's not about Wayne County. The goal was to see if Mr. Harris would offer information against the most prominent organized crime gang in Southern Illinois. I'm referring to the Buster Wortman gang in East St. Louis. Put another way, the feds are trying to flip Charlie Harris against Buster Wortman, who's the strong man in the East St. Louis gang. Now, why 1958? A little background here. When we hear of these stories of gangster activity in the 50s and the 40s and the 60s, these stories are told to us from a Wayne County perspective. I'm here to tell you there's more to this story than some bootleg joint in Pond Creek or some ramshackle bordello in Pond Creek. In 1958, Buster Wortman's gang in East St. Louis was the most active and prominent ring of organized crime in downstate Illinois. Be mindful of something. Buster Wortman's gang was very closely aligned with the Chicago Syndicate at the time, which is the successor to the Al Capone gang in Chicago. Prior to the late 1940s, the most prominent gang in Southern Illinois of organized crime was the Shelton gang. But by the late 1940s, there was open warfare between the Shelton gang, and on the other side was the Buster Wortman gang. And the FBI documents reach one conclusion. The hired gun for the Buster Wortman gang was Charlie Harris. And that battleground was right here. And all of this, ladies and gentlemen, this warfare between the Buster Wortman gang and the Shelton gang, it has the blessing of the Chicago Syndicate, the Chicago mob. Now, what surprised me when I looked through this first batch of documents from the department, or from the Bureau, was the willingness of Wayne County folk to step up and cooperate with the Bureau and act as informants during this investigation of Mr. Harris. And as is often the case, when an informant approaches law enforcement, be it in 1958 or 2021, the people who are doing this, the prospective informants, are not doing this out of some civic duty, but they have an axe to grind, or they themselves are in a compromising position and they need the help of law enforcement. One source that the Bureau developed in Wayne County was someone whose name is still redacted after all these years in these documents. The Bureau labeled him as Informant T1. He was described as a former member of the Shelton Gang. He claimed that Mr. Harris held a grudge against the Shelton Gang after Mr. Harris went to prison in the 1930s in Michigan on a federal charge of counterfeiting. And according to this source that the Bureau developed, Mr. Harris felt that the Shelton Gang had not taken care of him the way they should have when Mr. Harris is in federal prison in Leavenworth. Quote, according to T1, the Sheltons had not kept him supplied with what he considered his needs while in prison. T1 served as an informant for at least a 3-year period until 1961. T1 claimed the following. Harris is released from prison on the counterfeiting charge in 1937. He returns to Fairfield. He resumes work for the Sheltons then, even though he holds a grudge against the Sheltons. He managed a skating rink, a roller skating rink here in Fairfield. In 1940, there was an altercation at this rink. There was gunplay. One person was killed. And according to T1, Mr. Harris on this occasion saw this as an opportunity in the midst of this gunplay with this other person who was killed. Mr. Harris saw this as an opportunity to fire off a shot in the direction of Carl Shelton, the leader of the Shelton Gang. According to T1, this was the first instance that the Shelton Gang was aware that they had a problem with Charlie Harris, because prior to this, Harris had worked for them all throughout the Midwest, running booze, gambling, vice, God knows what else. Members of the Shelton Gang, according to T1, approached Carl Shelton and said, "You've got a problem with Charlie Harris. He's out to get us." Carl Shelton was reluctant to believe that Charlie had turned on him in 1940. He described this situation at the roller skating rink here in Fairfield as just to be a wild shot on the part of Charlie Harris. But apparently, according to T1, Carl Shelton decided that he's going to start keeping an eye on Charlie Harris. What appears next in this biographical sketch report from 1958 is that a number of informants about Fairfield told the same story over and again to the FBI. And the story went something along these lines. Mr. Harris would appear at a local establishment such as the Eagles or the American Legion or some other club, and he would report to them. And oftentimes Mr. Harris would be in the company of a member of the Buster Wortman gang. Again, this is 1958. This is in Fairfield. Now, years later, the Southern Illinois newspaper in Carbondale reported that this member of the Wortman gang who accompanied Charlie to the various clubs about Fairfield was a nephew of Buster Wortman named Gordon Foster. Under the scenario that all of these informants described, Mr. Harris would announce to the local establishment that he is now, in 1958, in the tip board business. And there is a not so subtle suggestion from Mr. Harris to the local club saying, "I'm coming in on the tip board business, you're going out." And if there was some hesitation to the person that Mr. Harris was speaking to at the local club, Mr. Harris used the same method over and over again. He would suggest that that member of the local club call a certain number, which he would provide while he waited on that call to go through. Now, it is not clear who Mr. Harris is setting up this call. who that call is going to. But I speculate, and my hunch is, when Mr. Harris is asking that call to go through, that call is going to a member of local law enforcement. Just by the way the FBI report reads. The person who took that call would then tell the member of the club, Charlie Harris is not such a bad guy. Maybe you ought to do business with him. The FBI had Mr. Harris under surveillance throughout 1958, throughout Wayne County. The special agent in charge, whose name is still redacted over these years, who was overseeing the surveillance of Mr. Harris, reported what he described as places of amusement and hangouts frequented by Charlie Harris during this time. He listed 4. Please allow me to list them for you. Some of these names may be familiar to you. Number 1, Beulah's Cafe, which the FBI described as a local bootleg joint. Boy, they got a lot of nerve saying that. Number 2, the Eagles Lodge was a hangout for Mr. Harris. Number 3, the American Legion. You want to guess what's number 4 on this list as places of amusement described by the FBI? Does anybody want to take a guess? I see no hands. Get ready for this one, folks. This is the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. Under personal habits and peculiarities, again, this is the biographical workup of Mr. Harris. This is how the FBI described our local hero. Harris is a very soft-spoken individual and likes to create the impression that he is a very mild-mannered individual who is harmless. It becomes clear when you look at these 1958 records, the FBI is not very impressed with local law enforcement. Now, a word of caution here. Just because the FBI thinks that does not make it so. It's common in investigations, criminal investigations, when you have 2 different agencies investigating the same thing and they're brushing up against one another, it's very common for there to be friction between the various law enforcement agencies. That could be what's going on here. I mean, we all live here. We love our hometown, don't we? But sometimes we're not real keen on outsiders, are we? Okay, I heard a little nervous chuckling, so maybe I'm partly right. You don't have to agree and say, testify, Matt Vaughn. But I think we can agree that sometimes that is the case with our little hometown. Regardless, it is very apparent that the FBI is scrutinizing a number of transactions that Mr. Harris is making with the locals. And these investigations reveal the following. Mr. Harris is borrowing money from the sheriff of Wayne County, Hal Bradshaw, to buy land from Hal Bradshaw. And there's a series of notes and releases between Mr. Harris and the sheriff of Wayne County, who in the course of these business transactions, Sheriff Bradshaw passed away. These portions of the records are still heavily redacted. But it appears that the sheriff of Wayne County in 1958, or maybe a few years before, signed a security instrument on behalf of Charlie Harris. Put another way, the sheriff is putting his name on the line and vouching for Mr. Harris in a financial sense. Meaning if Mr. Harris defaults on the loan, the sheriff's on the hook for the loan. The FBI spent a great deal of time in the Wayne County Clerk's office digging through real estate records. Spent a lot of time talking to local bank officials. The bottom line here from my perspective is the FBI would not have spent all this time doing this unless there was a reason. Now, we may not like that reason, and it doesn't look good in retrospect, but the feds were suspicious of what was going on in Wayne County. During the course of this 1958 investigation, Mr. Harris catches a charge out of Wabash County for driving under the influence of alcohol. That state's attorney in Wabash County bent over backwards to cooperate with the feds about this, what is a relatively low-level offense for Mr. Harris. And what the feds, the agent in charge what he learned after interviewing that state's attorney in Wabash County was that Mr. Harris's attorney defending that DUI in Wabash County is none other than the state's attorney in Wayne County, Bill Pierce. Now, the feds viewed that with suspicion. I don't see that as a suspicious situation. Because back then, being state's attorney in a place like Wayne County was not a full-time job. You were allowed to have a private practice on the side. And I see nothing really out of the ordinary for the state's attorney here to represent him. But if you're dealing with a big city FBI agent, they see it differently. And it's just part of the level of suspicion that's coming into play here towards local law enforcement. The FBI saw as a situation that of all the lawyers in the world, why would Charlie Harris hire a lawyer to defend him on a DUI? Of all the lawyers in the world he can pick, why does he pick the state's attorney in Wayne County? They saw that as odd. I don't see that as odd. I see things a little bit differently than they do. Regardless, as to the 1958 investigation, the findings of the Bureau were as follows. They reported that Mr. Harris's schemes at that time were mostly restricted to southern Illinois and southern Indiana, and they were small scale in nature, like the tip board business I described earlier. They did describe Charlie Harris as a former hired gun of the Shelton gang. And please allow me to quote a passage. Since investigation to date reflects that Harris is engaged in local operations, Harris will be interviewed for future information with the possibility of developing Harris as an informant who might be in a position to furnish valuable information regarding top hoodlums on a higher level. Now, I love the word hoodlums. We don't use that word often enough nowadays. So there it is. That's why the Bureau is doing what it's doing. This report I just mentioned, it's addressed to one person. You want to guess who this report's addressed to? J. Edgar Hoover. Oh. Now, I don't know that we can make a lot out of that because in the 1950s and even the 60s, Mr. Hoover kept a tight rein of all internal information in the Bureau. So I don't know that he actually signed off on it, but the point being is the agent who's involved was reporting to somebody very high up in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What is noteworthy about this whole thing is that Wayne County's own Charlie Harris is the target of the criminal intelligence program of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Wayne County's hit the big time. To the consternation of this agent who's tracking Charlie all over Wayne County, he could never get the opportunity to speak with Mr. Harris alone without tipping his hand to others who might be nearby. He wanted to be able to sit down and speak with Charlie Harris in a private setting. And this investigation goes from spring through summer through fall of 1958. And finally, in December of 1958, the agent goes to Charlie's house in Pond Creek. And please allow me to read this quote as to what the agent reported that he learned then. Quote, the interview with Harris was not productive as to his association with East St. Louis hoodlums or other contacts, unquote. Hoodlum, I love that word, again. Charlie Harris denied having any association with the Buster Workman gang in East St. Louis. Put another way, Charlie Harris is refusing to cooperate with the FBI. Put yet another way, the FBI effort to flip Charlie Harris against the East St. Louis Buster Workman gang failed. For reasons that are not clear, in 1962, this whole investigation was opened up again by the Bureau. It went nowhere again. Now, that's the first batch of documents. The next batch of documents, again, relate solely to the efforts of the Bureau to try to find Charlie Harris. Now, as most of you know, some of you can even recall, in 1964, August of 1964, 2 people are found dead in Pond Creek, Betty Newton and Jerry Merritt. Immediately, Charlie Harris is a suspect in this case. Almost immediately, Mr. Harris flees the jurisdiction, as far as we know. I knew the FBI was involved in this manhunt of Charlie Harris, who is a fugitive from justice on this occasion. What I did not know was the extent of the Bureau's involvement in terms of man hours and expense in their attempt to try to locate Charlie Harris. FBI agents are dispatched all across North America to try to find a lead as to where is Charlie Harris. I'm going to list some of the places where they went out to gather information. El Paso, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Hot Springs, Arkansas, San Francisco, where there was a former Shelton gang member who the FBI thought might have some information as to where to find Harris, Tampa Bay, Florida, Canada, Alaska. All in an effort to gather leads, not necessarily to find Harris, but to gather information as to where the investigation should go next. I would estimate that the man hours spent on this, some 400 to 500 man hours, at least. Now, the tenor of these FBI reports change in one critical regard as compared to the 1958 documents. These reports from the manhunt are darker. And I don't mean that in a color sense, but I mean in terms of tone and outlook. Time and again, every special agent in charge in our country is told by the top level of the FBI that Mr. Harris is to be considered to be armed and dangerous, and that he has killed some 20 to 25 people in the United States. There is not one mention in those 1958 documents about Charlie Harris killing 20 to 25 people. The Bureau is trying to develop him as a source, so they don't necessarily want him to look bad on paper. But the tenor of the Bureau and their perspective as to Mr. Harris changes abruptly. The only rational conclusion you can reach from this is if the Bureau is right, that Mr. Harris is responsible for the death of some 20 to 25 people, the only conclusion you can reach is that Charlie Harris was a hitman for the mob. Be it the Shelton gang, be it Buster Wortman's gang, be it the Chicago Syndicate, we know not. But I suspect there's a reason why the Bureau is putting 20 to 25 deaths on Mr. Harris's shoulders on this occasion. The search for Mr. Harris began in Wayne County, of course. In 1964, if you want information in Wayne County, where do you go? You go to the Wayne County Press. And it would appear, looking at these records, that every demented and crazy person in Wayne County who had a report, I think I know where Charlie Harris is, it seems like they carried it to the Wayne County Press. You can imagine how an investigation of this type, the citizens of the county are scared, okay? It brings out the worst in people, and all sorts of crackpots are showing up, and the Wayne County Press would routinely pass this information along to the FBI because there was nothing confidential about what these folks were telling the Wayne County Press. And here come the crackpots. And sometimes the agent who's dealing with this would become frustrated. One person at the Wayne County Press said, "You don't need to bother talking to this guy. He's windy." All right, that's an expression I haven't heard since I was a kid, windy. Okay, somebody who runs their mouth a lot, who doesn't have a lot to say, they're windy. That's what the Wayne County Press is saying about one person. The FBI received a tip that Charlie Harris was using the Wayne County Press as a messaging source to send out information to and from his associates. They got a tip that if you see an ad that says Thunder for sale, that's a message either from an associate of Mr. Harris or Mr. Harris to an associate, and follow up on it. Well, lo and behold, a few weeks later, that ad appears in the Wayne County Press. But the biggest surprise of all of these records that I read, and the thing that I've never heard anything about, is that this manhunt pursuit of the fugitive from justice, Charlie Harris, it goes, of all places, to Hollywood. Now, this makes no sense to me at all. There's at least one recording artist of the Columbia Records label, and I can remember when I was a kid, the Columbia Records label was a big deal in this country. If you're younger and you don't know what I'm talking about with independent recording now, just believe me when I tell you, if you were a recording artist for Columbia in 1964, that was a big deal in this country. The FBI goes to speak to this recording artist to ask about the whereabouts of Wayne County's Charlie Harris. Now, the FBI records here are the most heavily redacted of anywhere in all the documents of 400 some pages that I received. We do not know why the FBI is going down this path. The person who was the recording artist with Columbia Records did not deny that he or she knew Charlie Harris. But it is apparent when the FBI agent who's interviewing these Hollywood or show business entertainment types, it's very apparent that the FBI is approaching these folks with kid gloves and they're trying to be very discreet. They don't want to embarrass the entertainers or the people connected with show business that they're doing this investigation on. There was one LA source that said, yeah, I know Charlie Harris. Now, this source is not necessarily an entertainment source, but it's not labeled as such by the records, but there's an LA source that says, yeah, I know Charlie Harris. Last time I saw Charlie Harris, he was here in Los Angeles for the 1960 Democratic National Convention. What's that about? I mean, that makes no sense. This is, of course, the convention where John F. Kennedy is nominated to take the lead from his party running for president against Richard Nixon. Here's another curious one. Another person is interviewed. It is the wife of some entertainer. The FBI wants to speak with the husband more than the wife, but the husband's gone. The FBI asks the wife, we're here looking for Charlie Harris. Do you have any information? And the wife says, no, you really need to talk to my husband more than me. Well, where's your husband? Well, my husband's in Guam. Well, what's he doing in Guam? Well, it's part of an entertainment tour in the South Pacific in 1964. It's December 8th when the FBI is investigating this lead as to this entertainer who's in the South Pacific on a tour. Now, I see some older faces out here. Now, let's think about this for a minute. 1964, entertainment tour, South Pacific. What's the first thing you folks think of? Absolutely. And the internet is a wonderful thing. And lo and behold, the first time Bob Hope's tour went to South Vietnam was in 1964 in December. Now, the FBI records do not describe this person as being a member of the Bob Hope tour, but the pieces to the puzzle fit together. And guess what? The Bob Hope tour went to Guam in December of 1964. Now, the problem here is this wife says, my husband won't be back for 3 months. The Bob Hope tour in December of 64 was 3 weeks. Now, maybe the wife's buying time. I don't know. But she doesn't deny. In fact, she admits that she knows Charlie Harris. This report, again, is heavily redacted. And again, the Bureau is using kid gloves. By January 1965, the Bureau is ramping up the manhunt. A memo, a bulletin is issued by the director's office, J. Edgar Hoover's office, to every special agent in charge in the United States. Keep an eye open for Harris. Signed, John Edgar Hoover. Then in late 1965, Director Hoover issues a bulletin for Charlie Harris to go on the top 10 list. Now, that was a big deal back then. There had been another criminal from Georgia who fell off the top 10 list because the FBI found him. Guess what? There's a slot open for Charlie Harris. And here's what I forget a lot. And the folks I talk to in Wayne County, I think this is forgotten from time to time. What we forget about is that in 1964, Charlie Harris is 68 years of age. And at that time, he was the oldest person ever to crack the FBI's top 10 list. There's Wayne County's claim to fame, if you will. Director Hoover kept close tabs on that top 10 list. That was his pet project. That was his pride and joy. He kept that under his guidance. And when it came to issues related to publicity as to the top 10 list, J. Edgar Hoover's right in the middle of it. And when you look at these memos that are going back and forth in the department in April and May of 1965, the highest levels of the Bureau are signing off on them. J. Edgar Hoover's number 2 man, Clyde Tolson, signing off on this. Another person who's signing off on this is Mark Felt. Now, do we know who Mark Felt is? Who knows who Mark Felt is? All right, we got a couple hands. Mark Felt is the guy a few years ago who approached the press and admitted that he was deep throat in the Woodward and Bernstein investigation during the takedown of President Nixon. Okay? Mark Felt's signing off on this stuff. And by 1972, Mr. Felt was a very high level in the Bureau. Now, for whatever reason, by June of 1965, and again, be mindful here, Newton and Merritt are killed in August of 64, but by June of 1965, actually late May of 1965, the focus of the FBI's investigation for the whereabouts of Charlie Harris, the focus starts to develop on Central Illinois. And it's not really clear why when you look at these records. Harris, they developed information. Harris had been staying at a hotel in Springfield, and the FBI was building a source with respect to Harris staying in Springfield. The name of this source still is redacted after all these years. Time and again, the special agent in charge of the manhunt in Central Illinois approaches this person, who eventually becomes a source for the FBI. Time and again, this source is approached, and time and again, the source says, no, I am not cooperating, I am not helping. The FBI had built information that this source was helping Charlie Harris get around in Central Illinois, in particular, the Springfield, Decatur areas. Then, after all these efforts by the Bureau to try to get this source to give the FBI the goods on Charlie Harris, finally, after what the agent described as, quote, a vigorous interview, unquote, heaven knows what that means, in 1965 with an FBI agent. I don't know what that means. Use your imagination, folks. But finally, in June, the first or second week, I believe the second week of June, this source cracks. This source cracks. And he disclosed, okay, back on May 24, I gave Charlie Harris a ride to a gravel road located 6 miles east, 7 miles south of Fairfield. And according to that informant, Charlie Harris didn't say much during the whole trip from Springfield to Wayne County, except one thing. Harris more than once told him, I want to talk to a lawyer before I turn myself in. The FBI developed that information. The nationwide manhunt is no longer nationwide. The manhunt is here. And then the FBI brings in local law enforcement. They're looking for Harris. The target is much smaller. The target is South Wayne County. Charlie Harris is captured June 17, 1965, a few days after this source turned. There's a trial in November. Harris is convicted of the murders of Betty Newton, Jerry Merritt. The sentence is handed down in December of 1965, 60 years as to the Newton killing, 75 for the Merritt killing, 10 years for arson. All sentences are to be concurrent. Charlie Harris is 68 years of age. Now, what's interesting about all these documents, when they finally captured Charlie Harris, these memos, these documents that the FBI disclosing that capture, they go straight to the top of the United States Department of Justice, straight to the United States Attorney General, a man by the name of Nicholas Katzenbach, who earlier in that decade had been Robert Kennedy's number 2 man in the Bureau. So ends the story of the FBI and Charlie Harris. I failed to mention, another memo goes straight to the White House. to somebody who's described as a special assistant to President Johnson. Now, trying to synthesize all of this information and try to make sense of it all these years later is difficult. But I have some opinions, not facts, but I have some opinions, and I'll set them out for you, and then I can field some questions if you wish. I think the FBI was skeptical of local law enforcement from the start. I'm not sure that skepticism is always justified, but they were skeptical. I think what the Bureau was really, really worried about more than anything else was yet another Wayne County jury turning Charlie Harris loose on a murder charge. Because the fact of the matter is, there had been a murder, January of 1963. The victim was H.S. Taylor down in Pond Creek. There's a jury trial, Wayne County Courthouse, July of 1963. That jury acquitted Mr. Harris. I think the feds were worried that that was going to happen again. And I think that's why the FBI put so much time into this. The focus of the Bureau had suddenly changed. Again, they now were documenting that they believed Harris is good for killing some 20 to 25 people. And I think that explains why all the time money and expense trying to track him down. I think one of the most significant things is of this whole situation, I don't see how Charlie Harris is brought to justice unless the FBI is involved. I think this was a problem bigger than local law enforcement. The evidence is that Mr. Harris was traveling probably beyond Southern Illinois during this status. I know a lot of the locals think that he was hiding out in Pond Creek. I think that's possible for part of the time, but very clearly he's in Central Illinois by spring of 1965. And I think that is the big story here. I think the only way Charlie Harris is brought to justice, I think there are two ways. Either the FBI hauls him in, or he turns himself in after he gets a chance to speak with his attorney. Because there is more than one source in these records that says, I'm going to turn myself in, but first I want to talk to my attorney. Which is why folks don't like lawyers. Who has questions? We got one. Go ahead.
Two unrelated questions. Was